When the Valorian delegation first made contact with Earth, they expected to find a species paralyzed by the knowledge of their own insignificance in the cosmos. Every advanced civilization they had encountered across 300 star systems showed the same pattern: terror, submission, or desperate attempts at diplomacy. But humanity offered something different. Something that would eventually make the Valorians question everything they believed about power, fear, and what it truly means to be the strongest species in the galaxy. Dr. Valorian, Elena Vasquez stood in the observation deck of the United Nations orbital station when the sleek Valorian warship emerged from quantum space like a predator testing the waters of an unfamiliar ocean. She watched the massive vessel, easily 3 times the size of their largest battleship, settle into a geosynchronous orbit above Earth. In that moment, she understood that the entire future of human civilization balanced on the edge of a knife. Yet something inside her didn't panic. Something inside her remained remarkably, impossibly calm. Elena Vasquez had spent 30 years studying xenobiology and theoretical first contact scenarios, but nothing had truly prepared her for the moment when she stood face to face with Commander Kale of the Valorian 4th Fleet. He was tall, nearly 7 feet, with an exoskeleton of deep blue-black chitin that seemed to absorb light itself. His compound eyes, each the size of a human fist, reflected the sterile white walls of the UN diplomatic chamber. When he moved, he did so with the kind of calculated precision that came from a species that had conquered 87 worlds. Behind him stood 2 of his soldiers, their forms even more intimidating than their commanders. They carried weapons that weren't quite weapons, devices of unknown purpose that glowed with an eerie bioluminescence. The Valorians had arrived with overwhelming force, made it clear that they were taking measurements of Earth's defensive capabilities, and requested a meeting with human leadership. Elena had been chosen as the primary liaison because of her unique combination of diplomatic skills and scientific knowledge. "Your defenses are primitive," Kale said, his voice a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the bones of everyone in the room. He spoke perfect English, downloaded into his consciousness through a neural interface mere hours after arriving in Earth orbit. "Your weapons technology is approximately 300 years behind contemporary Valorian standards. Your fleet could not resist a single battle carrier for more than hours." Elena sat across from him at the negotiation table, flanked by General Morrison and UN Secretary General Park. She had briefed them extensively on what to expect. Valorian culture valued strength and clarity. They had no patience for weakness or deception. Commander Kale was essentially telling them that humans were beneath them militarily, which was true. Everyone in the room knew it. The question was what the Valorans intended to do with that knowledge. "Commander," Secretary General Park began, his voice steady, but Elena could detect the slight tremor beneath it. "We come to you in a spirit of peaceful cooperation. We hope to establish trade relationships and—" "Your cooperation is irrelevant," Kale interrupted, his compound eyes focusing entirely on Elena. "What interests me is your fear. In the last 73 contacts with new civilizations, every species, without exception, has demonstrated measurable biological markers of terror upon encountering superior military force. Your physiology shows none of these markers." The room fell silent. Elena felt 3 pairs of human eyes pivot towards her. She had been selected specifically because her heart rate remained controlled, because her cortisol levels didn't spike dangerously, because she appeared calm. But she hadn't realized the Valorans were monitoring them so closely, analyzing them so carefully. "I noticed this particularly in you, Dr. Vasquez," Kale continued, leaning forward slightly. His mandibles clicked in what Elena had learned to recognize as contemplation. "Your body chemistry suggests minimal fear response, minimal stress hormones, minimal adrenaline. Why do you feel no fear?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Elena became aware of the weight of history in that moment. This was the question that could define humanity's relationship with an interstellar power that could, if it wished, render their entire civilization extinct with the push of a button. She became aware that her answer would be analyzed, interpreted, dissected by Valorian command. It would be studied in their academies and discussed in their governmental chambers. Elena's mind raced through possible responses. She could lie, claim biological deficiency, present fear that she didn't actually feel. She could play weak, appeal to mercy or human rights or universal principles. She could deflect, but something inside her, something ancestral that stretched back through millions of years of human evolution, told her that Kale valued truth above all else. The Valorians had conquered their galaxy not through deception, but through absolute commitment to reality as it presented itself. So Elena told him the truth. "Because I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water. "I'm afraid of becoming less than we could be. I'm afraid of accepting limits that we haven't yet tested. I'm afraid of a universe where humanity stops trying to understand, to reach, to grow. But you, your weapons, your size, your technology, those are just manifestations of power you already have. What frightens me is wasted potential, not demonstrated force." Elena stood slowly, deliberately, keeping her movements open and non-threatening. She walked to the observation window that looked out at the Valorian ship. "You say we're primitive. You're right. Compared to you, we are. But I've studied human history for most of my life, Commander. Do you know what we do with primitiveness? We don't accept it. We don't bow to it. We learn from it. We use it as a foundation to build something different. The Valorians conquered 87 worlds by being the strongest. But humanity will do something the Valorians haven't yet done. We'll become strong in ways you can't yet imagine, because we're starting from a place where we have nothing to lose." She turned back to face him. "And that terrifies you? Doesn't it? Not me being calm, you being uncertain." Commander Kale's mandibles went completely still. His compound eyes seemed to shift in color, a phenomenon that Elena's training told her indicated intense emotional processing. The soldiers behind him made movements that General Morrison tensed at, but Kale raised one of his chitinous appendages, and they fell back into absolute stillness. "Remarkable," Kale said finally, his thrumming voice taking on new harmonics. "You exhibit the paradox of the young predator. Competent enough to be dangerous, naive enough to be unpredictable. Tell me, Dr. Vasquez, what do you believe humanity will become?" Elena felt something shift in the room. The air itself seemed different. She realized that something irreversible had just occurred, that Kale had been tested and had found something in humanity worth examining further. The conversation that followed lasted for 6 hours. By the end of it, the Valorians had agreed to a preliminary treaty, one that granted humanity protected status, while allowing limited technological exchange and cultural observation. When Commander Kale left the negotiation chamber, he paused at the doorway, his compound eyes fixed on Elena one final time. "You said you were afraid of becoming less than you could be," he said. "That fear you carry, Dr. Vasquez, that is the fear that made the Valorians strong. We lost it long ago. Perhaps that is why I came to Earth, to remember what hunger feels like." Part 2. The Expedition and the Revelation. 6 months after first contact, Elena found herself standing on the dark side of the moon, suited up and preparing for something that would have seemed impossible before the Valorian visit. They had offered to help humanity expand its reach beyond Earth orbit, not out of pure charity, but because they wanted to study human adaptation and resilience in extreme environments. Commander Kale had specifically requested Elena for this expedition. The Valorian research vessel hung above them like a metallic moon itself, its surface crawling with activity as their probe stations descended to the lunar surface. Elena was part of a joint team, 12 humans and 12 Valorians, tasked with establishing the first permanent human Valorian research settlement on the moon. It would serve as a testing ground for collaboration and a jumping-off point for deeper space exploration. But something strange had been happening in the weeks leading up to the launch. Elena had discovered inconsistencies in the Valorian historical records. Small things at first, dates that didn't align, technological advancement timelines that seemed impossible given their claims of linear progress, cultural references that didn't match their stated history. She had begun investigating quietly, comparing notes with other human scientists. And what she'd found was beginning to trouble her deeply. The Valorolians, despite their overwhelming technological superiority, seemed deeply afraid of something, and they weren't being honest about it. She raised this concern during one of her evening conversations with Commander Kyle, who had taken to spending time in the human section of the research vessel during the journey. He was fascinated by human art, music, and literature, things that humans created for the pure joy of creation, without immediate practical purpose. He had become, in a way that Elena hadn't expected, almost a friend. "Your historical records have gaps," Elena said carefully, showing him the discrepancies she'd discovered. Large gaps, approximately 400 years beginning from what would have been the period of your greatest territorial expansion. The records simply skip over that time period. What happened during those years? Cale was silent for a long time. His compound eyes dimmed, a sign Elena had learned meant profound emotion. He walked to the observation window and looked out at the stars, an almost human gesture of contemplation. "You are perceptive," he said finally. "That is why I wanted you here, Elena. Not because of what you said in the negotiation chamber, though that was important, but because I suspected you would eventually discover the truth, and I believed you would understand what that truth meant better than anyone else on your world." He turned back to her, and Elena saw something in his ancient compound eyes that she had never seen in a Valorian before. Vulnerability. 400 years ago, the Valoronians were not the dominant species in this region of space, Cale said. "We were powerful, yes, but we were not supreme. There was another species, the Zethrani. They conquered our homeworld when we were advancing rapidly but not yet invincible. They enslaved us for approximately 200 years. They used our intelligence, our capacity for innovation to strengthen their own empire. And then, one day, they simply disappeared." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "No ship launched to rescue the Valorians." Cal continued. "No explanation. No final battle. They simply left, taking their technology, leaving us with only the remnants of their discarded science. For nearly 2 centuries, my species believed we were alone, working to rebuild from the ashes of servitude, and then we began to advance again. We began to conquer. We told ourselves we were becoming strong. But the truth that we never spoke of, the fear that motivated every expansion, every conquest, was the terrifying possibility that they might return." Elena's mind was racing. "The Zethrani, you never actually defeated them. You never proved you were stronger. They just left." "Yes," Cale said quietly. "And for 400 years, we have told ourselves that our strength comes from our superior technology, our superior biology, our superior intellect. But deep in our consciousness, in the neural patterns that we have studied and studied, we know the truth. We are afraid, profoundly afraid, of returning to slavery, of being weak, of someone stronger coming to take everything we have built." She understood now why Cale had come to Earth, why he had been so fascinated by a species that showed no fear in the face of superior force, and why her answer to his first question had resonated so deeply with him. "You came here," Elena said slowly, "because you wanted to understand how a species could be so young, so weak, and still not be afraid." "I came here," Cale corrected gently, "because I suspected that perhaps true strength is not the absence of fear. Perhaps it is the courage to face uncertainty without letting it paralyze you. You humans, with your brief lives, your fragile bodies, your primitive technology, you have already faced extinction events. You have survived plagues and wars and natural disasters. And each time you have not learned to fear better. You have learned to hope better." He moved closer to Elena, a gesture that would have seemed threatening if not for the careful way he modulated his movements. The Zethrani had strength without the capacity for growth. They had conquered without the hunger that comes from having something to build from nothing. They became complacent. And then something. Perhaps they simply encountered something stronger. Perhaps they turned their power inward and destroyed themselves. But something ended their dominion. "And you're afraid it will happen to the Valorians," Elena said. "I am terrified," Cale replied. "But standing on this moon, watching your species work alongside mine, sharing our knowledge, building something neither of us could build alone. For the first time in 400 years, I believe that fear might not be our destiny, that perhaps the Valorians can learn what humans learned by necessity, that the strongest empires are not those built on conquest alone, but those built on growth, adaptation, and the courage to change." Elena looked at him, this ancient being from a civilization that had spanned stars, who had conquered dozens of worlds, yet who carried within him a fear that had shaped every decision his species had made for centuries. And she understood that the real reason Commander Cale had come to Earth was not to conquer, but to be conquered, to let his civilization be transformed by contact with something it couldn't simply dominate. "Then let's build something different," Elena said. "Not a Valorian colony on the moon, not a human outpost, but a place where both our species learn that we're stronger together than we could ever be apart. Kale's mandibles clicked, a sound that Elena recognized as something close to laughter. "You are dangerous, Doctor Elena Vasquez. Dangerous in ways that the Valorians have never encountered before. You do not seek to conquer us. You seek to transform us, to make us question who we are. Is that a bad thing?" Elena asked. "No," Kale said, looking back out at the stars. "It is exactly the thing we need." Part 3. The Transformation in the Future. 5 years after the establishment of the Lunar Research Station, humanity had changed. Not just technologically, though they had advanced by leaps and bounds through shared knowledge with the Valorians, but fundamentally, the presence of an advanced alien species had forced humanity to confront questions about its own nature, its own potential, and its own place in a larger cosmos. Elena was now the Director of Interspecies Research and Cultural Integration, a position that had barely existed in human government 5 years prior. She worked from a sprawling facility in Geneva, coordinating efforts between human scientists and a growing Valorian research division that had been established on Earth itself. The Valorians were no longer visitors. They were becoming part of human society, in limited but growing ways. But the transformation worked both directions. Elena had watched, over those 5 years, as the Valorian society underwent its own profound changes. The fear that Commander Kale had shared with her, the fear that had motivated every conquest and every military expansion, was being actively confronted. Valorian philosophers and historians were examining their past with new honesty. Valorian military doctrine was being radically revised, not to become weaker, but to become more sophisticated, more nuanced. Understanding that true strength didn't require constant expansion. The most significant moment came during a joint summit when representatives from the Valorian Council of Elders came to Earth to meet not just with human political leaders, but with ordinary humans, farmers, artists, children, workers, people who had no official positions but who represented the true spirit of human civilization. An elderly Valorian named Synthesis of All Patterns, a being who had been alive for over 300 years, was particularly affected by a conversation with a human named Marcus Chen, an engineer who had worked on the lunar station. Marcus had asked Synthesis a simple question. "What are you afraid will happen if you stop expanding?" "No," he said. "I mean, really, what are you afraid of? Because from where I'm standing, the only thing preventing species from being happy is being afraid of what happens when they stop trying to prove something." That conversation, which Elena later learned about through the official records, seemed to unlock something in the old Valorian. Within weeks, Synthesis of All Patterns had proposed something revolutionary to the Valorian Council, a formal end to their policy of territorial expansion. Not out of weakness, but out of a deliberate choice to redirect their energy into advancement that wasn't measured in conquered worlds. The Valorian response was mixed. Some saw it as treason, a betrayal of everything their species had built, but others saw something deeper. They saw an opportunity to answer the question that had haunted them for 400 years. What if the Zethrani hadn't simply left because they were stronger? What if they had left because that path, the path of endless conquest, led inevitably to a dead end? Elena found herself called upon to help mediate discussions between the more aggressive factions of Valorian society and the reformers. It was during one of these tense negotiation sessions that something remarkable happened. A Valorian general named Striker of First Targets, known for advocating the most hardline positions, asked to speak with Elena privately. They met in a garden that had been established in the Earth Orbit Station, a place where plants from Earth grew under artificial sunlight. A collaboration between human botanists and Valorian biotechnologists. Striker was an imposing figure, even larger than Commander Kale, with scarred chitin that spoke of decades of military campaigns. "I have been analyzing the data that Dr. Chen provided," Stryker said, referring to historical economic information about human societies. "I have been studying how civilizations advance, what makes them stable, what causes their collapse, and I have been studying Earth's history in particular." Elena waited, sensing this was leading somewhere important. "Your species has undergone many transitions," Stryker continued. "From hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies to industrial societies to information societies. Each transition was painful. Each one involved letting go of ways of life that had defined your civilizations. And yet you did it. Not because you had to, but because you recognized something was possible beyond what was known." He paused, his mandibles moving in a contemplative pattern. "The Valorians are facing the same transition. We are moving from a culture of conquest to a culture of something else. I did not want to admit this, but observing your species has shown me that transitions, while painful, are necessary. A civilization that cannot change is a civilization that is dying. Elena felt something profound in that moment. Does that mean you support the reforms? I support, Stryker said carefully, the recognition that we do not know what we will become. The Valorians have always needed to know. We conquered so we could control, could predict, could ensure our security. But your species has taught us something revolutionary. That uncertainty is not the enemy. That the willingness to be uncertain, to adapt, to change direction, this is a different kind of strength. He looked directly at Elena with his compound eyes. Commander Kale asked you why you felt no fear, but perhaps the better question is, why do you not need to conquer? And I believe the answer is that humans have something the Valorians lost long ago. You have faith in your capacity to create meaning, even in a universe that is fundamentally uncertain. That is not weakness. That is the most profound strength. Over the next 2 years, the Valorian society underwent its formal transition. The military remained, but shifted its focus from conquest to defense and peacekeeping. Research efforts that had been directed toward military advancement were redirected toward pure science, environmental restoration, even art and philosophy. It was a stunning transformation. Not painless, not without opposition, but real. Elena found herself reflecting on that first conversation with Commander Kale, as she stood once again in the observation deck above Earth. But this time she was joined by representatives of not just Valorian and human civilizations, but 3 other species who had been making peaceful contact with Earth over the past few years, each drawn by reports of a species and a civilization that seemed to understand something about transformation and growth. Do you ever regret it? A voice asked behind her. She turned to find Commander Kale approaching, looking somehow smaller than he had 5 years ago, though Elena knew that was probably just an illusion created by how much her own perceptions had shifted. Regret what? Elena asked. Telling me that I was afraid, Kale said. That moment created a cascade of consequences that has fundamentally altered Valorian society. I sometimes wonder if I did the right thing in accepting that truth. Do you feel no fear anymore? On the contrary, Kale said, I am more afraid now than I have been in my entire life. But it is a different fear. It is the fear of not knowing what we will become. And that fear drives us forward in ways that the old certainty never could. He stood beside her, looking out at the blue sphere of Earth rotating below them. Your species has a concept, he continued. I encountered it in human literature, the concept of coming of age, where a young being transitions into maturity, not by eliminating fear, but by learning to live with it, to use it as motivation rather than paralysis. I think, Kale said, that is what is happening to both our species now. We are coming of age together. And the universe, I suspect, is not prepared for what we will become. Elena felt a sense of profound peace settle over her. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of beginning something that would take generations to complete. She had answered a Valorian's question about fear 5 years ago, and that answer had rippled outward in ways that were still being calculated, still being understood. The universe was vast and uncertain, filled with dangers and possibilities in equal measure, but standing there with an ancient alien, watching humanity's world turn slowly beneath them, Elena felt something that could not be conquered or calculated or controlled. She felt hope. And more than that, she felt the knowledge that fear and hope were not opposites. They were 2 sides of the same force, the force that drives all conscious beings forward, that pushes them to transcend what they are and become what they could be. The Valorians had conquered their fear by conquering others. Humanity had learned to move forward by accepting that fear was not something to be vanquished, but something to be carried, something to be transformed into fuel. As the 2 of them stood in silence, watching the stars, Elena realized that this was the true victory. Not the technological sharing, not the expanded territory, not the alliances formed, but the transformation of fear itself from a tool of control into a doorway to growth. And somewhere in the vast cosmos, other civilizations would eventually learn this truth. They would encounter humanity and the Valorians. They would see what had become possible through cooperation and mutual transformation, and some of them would choose to join that revolution. Others would resist, would cling to the old ways of conquest and control, but the seed had been planted. The transformation had begun, and no force in the universe could stop what was growing.